Stop. Before you watch another video, you need to hear this. In 1960, a single signature on a piece of paper destroyed one of the richest families in America. And the worst part? They had no idea it was coming. 30 years of wealth, gone in 30 days. This isn't fiction. This is real. What you're about to discover will change the way you think about inheritance, trust, and family forever. Because this story proves that sometimes, the people closest to you are the ones hiding the darkest secrets. And if you think something like this could never happen to you or your family, think again. The signs were always there. They just didn't see them until it was too late. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how a forgotten clause became a death sentence for an entire bloodline's legacy. Real quick, if you love stories like this, stories that make you question everything, hit that subscribe button right now and leave a like. It helps me bring you more incredible true stories like this one. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. Let me take you back to 1960. The Harrington family. You probably never heard of them, but in their town, they were royalty. Thomas Harrington, the patriarch, owned half the real estate in the county. Factories, farmland, commercial buildings. The man was worth millions, and back in 1960, that meant something completely different than it does today. Adjust for inflation, and we're talking about the equivalent of hundreds of millions in today's money. Thomas had everything. A massive estate on the hill overlooking the town. Cars that most people only saw in magazines. His children went to the best schools. His wife wore jewelry that could pay off someone's mortgage. They were untouchable. Or so everyone thought. But here's where it gets interesting. Thomas was getting old. He was 73, and his health was failing. He knew he didn't have much time left. So he did what any wealthy man would do. He called his lawyer, a man named Richard Caldwell, and told him to prepare his last will and testament. Nothing unusual about that, right? People do it every day. The meeting happened in Thomas's study. Dark wood panels, leather chairs, the smell of old books and cigars. Richard brought the documents, and they spent hours going through everything. Who gets what? How the assets would be divided. Thomas had 4 children. Margaret, the oldest. Robert, the heir apparent who ran most of the family businesses. Catherine, who lived out of state with her husband. And James, the youngest, who everyone knew was Thomas's favorite even though he'd never admit it. Now here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Thomas didn't just divide his wealth equally. He couldn't. Because buried deep in the family history was a secret that only Thomas and Richard knew about. A debt. Not a small one. Not something you could pay off with a check. We're talking about a massive, life-altering obligation that Thomas had been hiding for decades. Back in 1931, during the Great Depression, Thomas's father had made a deal. The family business was about to go under. Banks were failing everywhere. People were losing everything. Thomas's father, desperate to save what his own father had built, went to a private lender. Not a bank. This was a man who operated in the shadows. Someone who didn't ask questions but expected absolute loyalty in return. The loan saved the family. It allowed them to buy up properties for pennies on the dollar when everyone else was selling. It's actually how the Harringtons became so wealthy in the first place. But here's the thing about deals made in desperation. They come with strings attached. Strings that don't just disappear when you want them to. The terms were simple on the surface. The loan would be repaid with interest over time. But there was a clause. A special condition that Thomas's father agreed to, probably because he thought he'd never have to deal with it. The clause stated that if the debt wasn't fully repaid by the time the second generation took control of the estate, the entire outstanding balance would become due immediately. Not in installments. Not over time. Immediately. Every single penny, plus accumulated interest over 3 decades. Thomas's father died in 1945. Thomas took over. And he made a choice that would haunt his family forever. He didn't pay off the debt. Maybe he thought he had more time. Maybe he convinced himself the lender was dead or had forgotten. Maybe he was just arrogant enough to believe that rules didn't apply to him. Whatever the reason, Thomas pushed that debt to the back of his mind and focused on growing the empire. So when Thomas sat down with Richard in 1960 to write his will, he had a problem. The debt was still there. It had grown. With compound interest over nearly 30 years, what started as a significant but manageable amount had become astronomical. And according to the original agreement, the moment Thomas died and his children inherited the estate, that debt would come due. Richard advised Thomas to come clean. Tell the children. Prepare them. Maybe even start liquidating assets to pay it off before it was too late. But Thomas refused. And this is where pride destroys everything. Thomas believed he was invincible. He thought he could control the situation even from beyond the grave. Instead of warning his family, Thomas did something incredibly calculated and incredibly stupid at the same time. He added a clause to his will. A clause that his children would only discover after his death. The clause acknowledged the debt and stated that it would be paid from the estate before any inheritance was distributed. Sounds reasonable, right? Except Thomas massively underestimated how much that debt had grown. He assumed, based on outdated calculations, that the debt represented maybe 20% of his total wealth. Painful, but survivable. His children would still inherit millions. They'd be upset about the surprise, but they'd get over it. What Thomas didn't account for was the specific way the interest had been calculated in the original 1931 agreement. It wasn't simple interest. It was compounding, and the rate increased every decade the loan remained unpaid. Richard tried to tell him. He pulled out the original documents and showed Thomas the numbers. But Thomas dismissed him. He was convinced the lender's family wouldn't actually enforce it. It had been 30 years. Surely they'd be willing to negotiate, to settle for less. He bet his family's entire future on that assumption. Thomas signed the will in March 1960. Richard witnessed it, filed it away, and went home that night feeling sick to his stomach. He knew what was coming. He knew that will was a bomb with a timer, and when it went off, the Harrington family would be destroyed. Thomas died in November 1963. Heart attack. Quick and relatively painless. He went to bed one night and never woke up. The funeral was massive. Half the town showed up. Politicians, business owners, families who'd worked for the Harringtons for generations. Everyone talked about what an incredible man Thomas was. What a legacy he was leaving behind. His 4 children stood at that funeral with no idea their lives were about to implode. They were already planning what they'd do with their inheritance. Margaret wanted to travel, to finally live the life she'd put on hold while taking care of their mother. Robert was ready to expand the business empire even further. Catherine was thinking about the foundation she could start. James just wanted to prove he could manage money as well as his father had. The will reading was scheduled for a week after the funeral. Standard procedure. Everyone gathered in Richard's office. The same office where Thomas had signed that document 3 years earlier. Richard looked awful. He'd barely slept since Thomas died. He knew what was in that envelope, and he knew these people's lives were about to end as they knew it. He read through the standard provisions first. The house goes to Robert. Certain properties to Margaret. Investments split between Catherine and James. Everyone was nodding, taking notes, already calculating their net worth. And then Richard got to page 7. The clause. He read it out loud, his voice shaking. There was silence for a moment. Then Robert laughed. He actually laughed. He thought it was a joke. It wasn't a joke. And in part 2, you'll discover exactly how fast everything fell apart. Because what happened in the next 30 days makes most horror stories look like fairy tales. Listen, I need you to do something for me right now. Pause the video for just 2 seconds and hit that subscribe button.
Why?
Because stories like this, stories that most people will never hear about, they don't get told unless you help spread them. Drop a comment telling me what you think Thomas should have done differently. Would you have told your family the truth? And if you're hooked on this story, smash that like button because part 2 is about to get absolutely insane. Trust me, you're not ready for what comes next. The number Richard read out loud didn't make sense at first. It was too big. Robert asked him to repeat it. So Richard did. Slowly. The outstanding debt, with accumulated interest, was $4.7 million. Due immediately upon Thomas Harrington's death. Margaret gasped. Catherine grabbed her husband's hand so hard he winced. James just stared at the wall. Robert shook his head and said that couldn't be right. That was more than half of everything their father owned. Richard slid a folder across the table. Inside was the original 1931 loan agreement. Yellowed paper. Ink that had faded but was still readable. And there it was, in black and white. The clause that Thomas's father had signed in desperation. Robert snatched the folder and started reading. His face went from confused to angry to pale in about 30 seconds. He looked up at Richard and asked the only question that mattered. Who did they owe this money to? Richard cleared his throat and said the name. Marcus Sullivan. Or more accurately, the Sullivan estate, now managed by Marcus's grandson, David Sullivan. Here's what made this worse. The Sullivans still lived in town. David Sullivan ran a small accounting firm. Nothing fancy. He drove a normal car, lived in a normal house. The Harringtons had barely noticed he existed. And now they owed him almost $5 million. Robert immediately went into denial mode. He said there was no way this was legal. Debts that old couldn't just come back like this. There had to be a statute of limitations. Richard explained, very carefully, that the debt had never gone away. It had been acknowledged in writing multiple times over the years. Thomas had made small payments here and there, just enough to keep it active. And the original agreement was ironclad. It had been reviewed by 3 different law firms over the decades. It would hold up in court. Catherine asked the obvious question. Why didn't their father tell them? Why did he hide this? Richard didn't have a good answer for that. He said Thomas believed it wouldn't be this bad. That he thought there would be room to negotiate. Catherine called their father a coward. Margaret started crying. James just sat there, completely silent, his jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscles twitching. Robert wanted to fight it. He wanted to take this to court, drag it out, find some loophole. Richard told him that would be a mistake. The moment they contested the debt, David Sullivan could file a claim against the entire estate. Everything would be frozen. The businesses, the properties, the bank accounts. All of it. And court battles cost money. Money they would need to pay the debt. So Robert asked the next logical question. What if they just paid it? They could liquidate some assets, sell off properties, take out loans against the rest. $4.7 million was a lot, but the estate was worth maybe $8 or $9 million total. They'd take a hit, but they'd survive. Richard looked down at his hands and told them it wasn't that simple. Because here's what Thomas didn't understand about the agreement. The $4.7 million was just the principal and standard interest. There was another clause. A penalty clause. If the debt became due upon inheritance and wasn't paid within 30 days, additional penalties would start accumulating. Not monthly. Daily. At a rate of 1% of the total outstanding balance per day. Let me break that down for you. 1% of $4.7 million is $47,000 per day. After 30 days of non-payment, they wouldn't owe $4.7 million anymore. They'd owe almost $6.2 million. After 60 days, over $7.5 million. The debt would grow faster than they could possibly pay it. Robert stood up so fast his chair fell over. He started yelling, asking how this was legal. How anyone could enforce something so predatory. Richard just kept saying that it was in the contract. That Thomas's father had signed it. That Thomas had acknowledged it. That 3 generations of lawyers had reviewed it and found it valid. Margaret asked through her tears if David Sullivan knew about this. Richard nodded. He'd already been contacted. He'd been waiting for Thomas to die. Not in a malicious way, Richard clarified. David's grandfather had left instructions. The loan was to be called in upon the death of the 2nd generation Harrington. That was the deal. David was just following through. James finally spoke. He asked if they could talk to David. Explain the situation. Ask for mercy or a payment plan. Robert laughed bitterly and said they'd be begging someone they used to look down on to save them. But what choice did they have? The meeting with David Sullivan happened 2 days later. The Harrington siblings sat in his modest office, surrounded by filing cabinets and basic furniture. David was in his 40s, thin, with glasses and a quiet demeanor. He didn't look like someone who was about to destroy a family. He looked like someone's accountant. Robert started with anger. demanding to know what kind of person enforces a debt like this. David didn't react. He just slid a folder across his desk. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Letters from his grandfather to Thomas's father. Letters from his father to Thomas. All of them asking about repayment. All of them ignored or dismissed with token payments that barely covered a fraction of the interest. David spoke quietly. He said his family wasn't wealthy like the Harringtons. That loan in 1931 was everything his grandfather had. He gave it in good faith to help a neighbor in need. And instead of being repaid, he was strung along for decades. He died waiting for money he was owed. David's father died the same way. And now it fell to David to finally collect. Catherine tried sympathy. She explained that they didn't know about the debt, that their father had hidden it from them, that punishing them for his mistakes wasn't fair. David agreed. He said it wasn't fair. Just like it wasn't fair that his family lived modestly while the Harringtons built an empire with borrowed money they never intended to fully repay. Margaret offered a compromise. They'd pay the $4.7 million. It would take time to liquidate assets, but they'd do it. They just needed David to waive the penalty clause. Give them 6 months, maybe a year. David shook his head. He said the penalty clause existed for exactly this reason, to prevent the debt from being pushed down another generation. James asked what David wanted from them. Money they didn't have in cash? David said no. He wanted what was owed. And if they couldn't pay in cash, he'd accept property, businesses, assets, whatever it took to clear the debt within the 30-day window. Robert exploded. He said David was trying to steal their inheritance. David's voice got harder. He said you can't steal what was never yours. That estate was built on his family's money. The Harringtons had been thieves for 3 generations. He was just taking back what belonged to his family. The meeting ended with nothing resolved. The Harringtons had 26 days left before the penalties started. They went back to Richard's office and started doing math. The real estate was worth maybe $5 million if they could sell it quickly. But quick sales meant taking lowball offers. The businesses were profitable but would take months to sell properly. The liquid assets, the cash and stocks, totaled about $1.3 million. Even if they liquidated everything, sold at a loss, and moved fast, they'd barely cover the debt. And that meant there'd be nothing left to inherit. 3 generations of wealth, wiped out in a month. But it got worse. Because as they started the process of selling assets, they discovered something that made Robert punch a wall. Several of the properties weren't just owned by the estate. They had mortgages. Thomas had been leveraging the real estate to fund his lifestyle. The actual equity was about 30% less than they'd calculated. They were short. Even if they sold everything, they'd still owe David Sullivan almost $800,000. And they had 3 weeks left. Margaret suggested they borrow the difference. Take out personal loans, use credit, whatever it took. But banks don't loan that kind of money to people who are in the process of losing everything. They were rejected everywhere they went. Catherine's husband offered to help. He had some savings, about $50,000. It was a drop in the bucket, but Catherine broke down crying because it was more than her own family's legacy could provide. James came up with the most desperate idea. He wanted to go public. Tell their story to the newspapers. Make David Sullivan look like a villain. Maybe public pressure would force him to back down. Robert actually considered it until Richard explained that going public would alert all of Thomas's other creditors. People the estate owed smaller amounts to. They'd all file claims immediately, trying to get paid before the assets were gone. It would start a feeding frenzy that would destroy them even faster. They were trapped. Every option led to ruin. And the clock kept ticking. With 2 weeks left, they made a decision that would splinter the family forever. They would give David Sullivan everything except one property. The family home. They'd transfer the businesses, the commercial real estate, the investments, everything. In exchange, they wanted David to forgive the remaining balance and let them keep the house. David considered it for 3 days. Then he agreed, with one condition. The house had to be put in a trust that prevented them from selling it for 10 years. He didn't want them turning around and cashing out the one thing he'd let them keep. They signed the papers with 8 days to spare. The Harrington empire transferred to David Sullivan. Decades of wealth gone. The 4 siblings were left with a house they couldn't sell and almost nothing else. But the story doesn't end there. Because remember what I said at the beginning. Betrayals and buried secrets. What the siblings didn't know was that one of them had known about the debt all along. And that person had been planning for this moment for years. Hold on. If you're still watching this, you need to subscribe right now because what I'm about to reveal in part 3 is going to blow your mind. One of the siblings knew everything, and they let their own family walk into disaster. Comment below who you think it was. Margaret, Robert, Catherine, or James. Hit that like button if this story has you completely hooked, because the ending is darker than you can imagine. 3 months after they signed everything over to David Sullivan, Margaret found the letters. She was cleaning out her father's study, boxing up his personal items, when she discovered a false bottom in his desk drawer. Underneath were envelopes. Dozens of them, all addressed to James. Her hands shook as she opened the first one. It was from Thomas, dated 1959, a year before he wrote the will. The letter was short. Thomas told James about the debt. Every detail. The amount, the terms, the penalty clause. Everything. And then Thomas wrote something that made Margaret's blood run cold. He told James that he was leaving him specific instructions in a separate document. Instructions on how to protect himself when the debt came due. Thomas knew James was his smartest child, the one who understood money and legal structures. He was trusting James to survive what was coming. Margaret opened another letter. This one was from 1961, after Thomas had signed the will. Thomas wrote that he'd created a series of shell companies in James's name. Small businesses that appeared to be independent but were actually funded by the estate. When the debt was called in, these companies wouldn't be touched because legally they belonged to James, not the estate. There were 12 letters total. Each one revealed another piece of Thomas's plan to save his favorite son while sacrificing the others. The final letter, written just months before Thomas died, told James exactly when to move money out of certain accounts, when to transfer assets, how to make it look legitimate so no one would question it. Margaret sat on the floor of that study and realized her baby brother had let them lose everything while he secretly built his own fortune. She called Robert immediately. Then Catherine. Within an hour, all 3 of them were in that study, reading the letters, understanding the scope of the betrayal. Robert wanted to confront James immediately. Margaret said no. They needed to be smart about this. If James had been moving money for years under their father's instructions, he'd covered his tracks well. They needed proof of what he'd taken. They needed to know exactly how much he'd stolen from them. They hired a forensic accountant. Someone outside the family who could trace financial transactions without tipping off James. It took 6 weeks and cost them money they didn't have. But what they discovered was so much worse than they'd imagined. James hadn't just protected himself. He'd actively profited from the family's destruction. Remember those quick sales they'd made to pay David Sullivan? The properties they'd sold at a loss? 3 of them had been purchased by shell companies that James controlled. He'd bought his own family's assets at bargain prices through intermediaries. The business that Robert had spent 15 years building? Sold for 60 cents on the dollar to clear the debt? James owned 40% of the company that bought it. He'd partnered with outside investors, used his inside knowledge of the business's real value, and essentially stolen it from his own brother. The investment portfolio that was supposed to be split between all of them? James had been slowly moving the best-performing stocks into his personal accounts for 3 years before Thomas died. He'd replaced them with struggling stocks that looked similar on paper but were worth significantly less. The accountant estimated that James had hidden or redirected about $2.3 million in assets. Money that should have been part of the estate. Money that could have helped them pay the debt without losing everything. Robert wanted to call the police, press charges for fraud and theft. But their lawyer explained the problem. Thomas had written those instructions to James. He'd authorized the transfers. Legally, it wasn't theft. It was estate planning. Unethical? Absolutely. Illegal? Probably not. Thomas had the right to give his money to whoever he wanted, even if he did it in secret. Catherine asked if they could sue James in civil court. Maybe they couldn't put him in jail, but they could force him to give back what he'd taken. The lawyer said they could try, but it would cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees. Money they didn't have. And James would fight it with the fortune he'd hidden. He could afford to drag it out for years. They couldn't afford to fight for months. Margaret made a decision. She called James and told him they needed to meet. All four siblings. One last time. James agreed, probably because he thought he'd gotten away with it. He showed up at the family home wearing an expensive suit. New watch. He looked successful while his siblings looked exhausted and broke. Margaret didn't waste time. She put the letters on the table. Watched James's face go pale. Then she laid out everything the forensic accountant had found. Every transaction. Every hidden asset. Every betrayal. James tried to deny it at first. Then he tried to justify it. He said Thomas had wanted him to survive. That he was just following their father's wishes. Robert asked him how he could watch them lose everything and say nothing. James's answer was chilling. He said someone had to preserve the family wealth. That the three of them would have just split the money and wasted it. That he was investing it, growing it, making sure the Harrington name meant something in the next generation. Catherine called him a monster. James didn't even flinch. He said they were weak. That they'd proven it by rolling over for David Sullivan instead of fighting. That Thomas was right to choose him as the one to carry on the legacy. Margaret asked him one question. If their father had told him to betray his own blood, what did that say about the kind of man Thomas really was? James didn't have an answer for that. The meeting ended with Margaret telling James he was no longer her brother. Catherine and Robert agreed. They cut him out of their lives completely. No phone calls. No holidays. No reconciliation. As far as they were concerned, James Harrington died the same day their father did. But the consequences of Thomas's choices weren't done destroying lives. 6 months later, Robert's marriage fell apart. The stress of losing everything, of being betrayed by his own father and brother, broke him. He started drinking. His wife left and took their kids. He ended up working as a manager at a hardware store, a job that paid less in a year than he used to make in a month. Catherine's husband, the one who'd offered his savings to help, died of a heart attack a year later. The doctors said it was stress-related. Catherine blamed herself. Blamed the family. She moved across the country and changed her last name. Tried to start over where no one knew the Harrington story. Margaret stayed in the family home, the one asset they'd managed to keep. But it became a prison. She couldn't afford to maintain it properly. The roof started leaking. The garden her mother had loved grew wild. She'd walk through those empty rooms and remember what it felt like when the house was full of life. Now it was just her and the ghosts of what they'd lost. James. He thrived. Used the money he'd hidden to invest in real estate and technology. By 2000, he was worth more than Thomas had ever been. He got married, had kids, joined country clubs. Built the exact life his father had wanted for the Harrington name. And he did it by destroying everyone else who carried that name. David Sullivan, the man who'd collected the debt, lived quietly. He sold most of the properties and businesses he'd acquired. Kept a few as long-term investments. The money didn't change his life much. He still lived in the same house, drove the same car. When asked about the Harringtons, he'd say he had no ill will toward them. He'd just been settling a debt that should have been paid decades ago. But here's the thing that makes this story truly tragic. In 2003, someone doing research on Depression-era loans discovered something about the original 1931 agreement. The interest calculation that had made the debt so massive? It was based on a clerical error. Whoever had typed up the contract had put the decimal point in the wrong place. The interest rate should have been 0.5%, not 5%. If the correct rate had been used, the debt in 1963 would have been about $800,000. Painful, but manageable. The family would have survived. The estate would have stayed intact. None of the betrayal, none of the destruction would have happened. Marcus Sullivan, David's grandfather, had probably never noticed the error. Or if he had, he'd chosen not to correct it. Maybe he felt the Harringtons owed him more than money. Maybe he wanted revenge for being ignored for so many years. Whatever the reason, that single misplaced decimal point changed everything. By the time the error was discovered, it was too late. The statute of limitations on challenging the contract had long passed. The assets were sold. The family was destroyed. There was no going back. Margaret died in 2010, alone in that big house. They found her 3 days later when a neighbor noticed the newspapers piling up. Robert died in 2015, cirrhosis of the liver from decades of drinking. Catherine is still alive, living under a different name in Oregon. She refuses to talk about the family or what happened. And James? He's in his 80s now. Still wealthy. Still successful. His children have no idea that their fortune was built on betrayal. He had the letters from Thomas destroyed years ago. Erased as much of the evidence as he could. In his version of the story, he's a self-made man who built an empire through smart investing. The Harrington house was finally sold in 2012 after Margaret's death. A young family bought it, renovated it, turned it back into a home. They have no idea about the secrets that house holds. The betrayals that happened in that study. The family that destroyed itself in those rooms. So what's the lesson here? What do you take away from a story like this? Maybe it's that secrets always have a cost. That greed doesn't just destroy the greedy, it destroys everyone around them. That blood isn't always thicker than water, and sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones who hurt you most. Or maybe the lesson is simpler. That a single decision, a signature on a piece of paper, a clause hidden in a contract, can echo through generations. That the choices we make don't just affect us. They ripple outward, touching everyone connected to us, in ways we can't predict or control. Thomas Harrington thought he was protecting his legacy. Instead, he destroyed it. He thought he could control what happened after his death. He couldn't. He bet everything on pride and secrecy and the belief that he knew better than everyone else. And he lost. The blood testament. That's what Richard Caldwell called it years later when he was interviewed about the case. Because that will wasn't just a legal document. It was a death sentence written in ink and sealed with a family's blood. And like all tragedies, it was completely preventable. If Thomas had been honest. If he'd paid the debt. If he'd trusted his children with the truth. But he didn't. And 30 years of wealth vanished in 30 days. 4 lives destroyed. A legacy turned to ash. All because one man thought he could cheat the consequences of his choices. If this story affected you the way it affected me when I first discovered it, do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel. Because there are hundreds of stories like this out there. True stories about greed, betrayal, and the price people pay for secrets. Stories that need to be told. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another one.